Peter, thanks,
Hey,
man.
Drew.
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah.
I give Peter a hard time. The truth is I've been after Peter to share his story since we've started doing podcasts. And in his great humility, he's been deferring, but I finally got him to share with us tonight. And talk
That was a cancellation.
Last minute cancellation. Tell us a little bit about. We're gonna get into some stuff about anxiety and kind of the lies we tell ourselves. And you've done a lot of work around that stuff. But I want to know first about just kind of how you got into this role here at Valiant.
Here at Valiant, yeah. So, one of the main reasons I came to Valiant was because of the career development track and the focus on that. And so, I did a lot of, while I was here, I did a lot of work. I was really completely adrift in my career. I wasn't working. I said I was. I was doing a real estate deal here or there, just to, tell myself I was doing something. But it was really that, like, I need to figure that piece out. I need to figure out that purpose, in my life. I was living alone with my dog. I was 50 years old, never married, no kids. And so it was like, all right, I gotta, what I've been doing has never filled my cup, so to speak. And so that's kind of, how I wound up at Valiant as a client. And then, after I did all the testing and stuff like that, we had a full-on like career counselor here at the time, Lori Odenauer, amazing woman, long-term recovery, nationally known. And she had all these different assessments and stuff she would do, and values and card sorts and stuff. And I'd be on the floor with like 80, playing cards with different values on them, rearranging them and stuff like this. And so when the tea leaves were read, it was, well, you should go back to school and become a therapist. And I was like, well, that sounds great, but that wasn't in the financial plan. And I was fortunate enough to, not have to pay for school the first time and deal with student loans and stuff. And so I was like, well, let me just get into this field and see if I like it. And so I kind of kicked around for about a year or so after I left Valiant. And then, I got back in touch with Deneen, and, I'd kind of been looking for what they call business development role, which is a sales role in this field. Sales has a little bit of a nasty taste to it when you're talking about mental health, right? And so Deneen, said, look, I don't have the seat on the bus you're looking for. Why don't you just get on the bus, right? And I was like, done. I'm like, done. So I started out as a housing tech and, doing the piss cups and doing the Costco runs and picking people up and, stuff like that, and talking to guys at the house and having those, those hard conversations that, that happen, at Foxfield, right? Yeah. When people are just like, they're exhausted at the end of the day from deep therapy and groups and stuff. And it's like things come to a head. And so then I just kind of, moved through things from there as the need presented. So then there was a need for a case manager. So I became a case manager. And then our former admissions director, Mike Campbell, was, needed help in admissions. And so he mentored me and brought me into admissions and business development role. And then, there was some, staff changes and stuff last summer. And so then, then I took over the, chief marketing officer role. So, which I love because it gives me a hand in a lot of different things. So.
Yeah, I was about to say, because you're over business development, marketing, both for Detox and for here. So it's quite a bit that you're leading. I'm curious how your roles in housing and some of the other things, case management, shapes kind of how you do your job in business development.
Yeah,
does it at all?
It totally does. It totally influences it, because it goes from it takes me out of just like that business role of like looking at, KPIs and metrics and, dollar amounts and stuff like that, and brings that human element back into it, where it's like, hey, this is someone's life that we've been entrusted with. And, everybody's got like that first week or two that's really hard and really dicey. And so it helps me keep perspective on that when I'm talking, when I'm having the fifth conversation of the day with a traumatized wife who's doesn't know where to turn and is crying and sobbing. And it keeps the humanity alive in me, right? Where it's not just like, hey, I'm sitting in a call center and then on a 50-person admissions team at some big program and just like and trying to knock down calls. So
Well, I've heard you on some of those admissions calls, and maybe some of the guys in this room have been on those where it really is front lines of, it's not therapy, of course, but there's a lot of things that you've learned that's coming up in those conversations because, like you said, they're sometimes the lowest moment of their life is when they're talking to you, calling you on the phone.
Yeah, it's true. And so I tell a lot of the guys on that first call, look, for what it's worth, I've been there. And then when they open up and they talk to me, I always follow it up with, an expression of gratitude and saying, you've been really vulnerable and talking to a stranger on the other end of the phone. And I'm going to do the same for you. And I'm going to tell you a little bit, just for a second about, me and where I've been, let you know that I've been right where you are. And that's why I chose to do this work. So.
How do you manage working in this field and caring for your own mental health? Because you're in it all day long, you're working it all the time. What are the challenges there?
Yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword. It's a huge part of my recovery program, like working here. But then it can be a real threat to my recovery as well. And people told me that when I got into this field, they're like, look, this field can really churn people out or really tap into some of your deep issues and really put a stress on the system. And so I was always kind of really mindful of that, and I was like really all in. I was like, give me more work, give me more work, give me more work. And then finally, like I started feeling it come on, and I was like, oh shit, I've stepped a little too close to the edge, and I got to step back. And I remember I was standing in my buddy's kitchen about a month or two after I'd started the job, and his wife, he'd put his ex-wife through treatment 3 times, and wound up having to divorce her. And was raising 3 kids on his own, and he's an interventional pediatric cardiologist. So for a living, he puts very small things into very small hearts, newborns, et cetera. And he said to me, look, you got to be careful with this work that you're doing. He said, the nurses on my team, some of them get way too close to the families. They exchange cell phone numbers. They're talking to them late at night. He said, I have to keep a boundary because I won't be able to continue doing this work. If I get too attached, and he loses, I think, somewhere around like 30 or 40 kids a year, in his job.
Wow.
And so that gave me a lot of perspective on, being open and being vulnerable, but also, putting up some barriers or at least letting things pass through me. Yeah.
Well, really grateful for the work that you're doing, and Valiant, I think, is in, from a business side, the healthiest place it's been in probably ever. And I know when I was here, I was like, I heard about the 3rd floor. I never went up there. It was like, what's going on the 3rd floor? I didn't know it exists. But you guys are doing fantastic work in getting, guys in the program, but also just the health of the program, and a lot of that's due to your leadership. But I want to dig into your story a little bit, because I know, and I don't actually know this part of your story, but you said that there's 2 really specific things that happened in your life that kind of shaped who you are and what got you here. So I'd love to hear that. I'd love to hear, what are those things?
Yeah, it goes back a little ways. So it's going to sound cliche, but it started with a bad acid trip at a Grateful Dead concert. That was a big left turn in my life. It was the day before my 22nd birthday. I was home in Chicago from college for spring break. It's spring break senior year. And I was a daily pot smoker and, kind of a regular college drinker, and occasionally I'd, take some acid or do some mushrooms or something. But I was always kind of an anxious kid. I've heard it described as a duck in a still pond, right? A lot of people tell me, wow, you seem so calm all the time. No, like everything looks good on the surface, but underneath, the feet are going like this all the time. And so I'm on my way. I'm on the L with my friends. We're on our way to this Grateful Dead concert. And this was these were my people. This was my scene. I'd been countless shows at this point. And somebody's like, hey, we're all going to drop acid. I'm like, okay, maybe this is going to be my last time, right? Like it was just, I was getting a little too old for it, a little tired of it. And it wound up being the quintessential bad acid trip that, maybe you've seen portrayed in movies in Hollywood. God help you if you ever went through one yourself. But this train came out of the station and it was a nightmare for the next basically 12 hours.
Wow.
And I couldn't function. Like my friends had to help me into the concert. They had to basically coddle me the whole concert. I was sitting in a chair, like shaking the whole time. And so it was really bad. And so, acid trips, last a while. So, usually 10 or 12 hours. And so the next morning I woke up and it was my 22nd birthday and I was feeling a little weird still. I was like definitely still coming down out of it. But then fast forward about a week or so later, I'm back at school, I'm on campus, and I see one of my buddies and I tell him about what happened at the show. And he's like, wow, that sounds awful. He's like, hey, let's go pull a couple bong hits and chill out, right? So we go and I smoke weed and boom, a switch flips and I'm tripping again. And
Like back into the same
thing. And if you can imagine like that feeling that you get when you look in the rearview mirror and you see the rollers, it was that feeling times 10. And I was like, holy shit, what is happening? So I go to my girlfriend's house, I go home, I go to bed. I wake up the next morning and it's still going, full bore. And it wound up lasting about 90 days or so.
90?
I know, yeah. So every day I would wake up and before I'd open my eyes, I would pray to God that it would be over. And unfortunately it wasn't. And so I didn't know what to do. So I had to, this is pre-internet. This is, information is not readily available, right? There's the library, there's the phone book. So I find a counselor on campus and I tell him about what's going on. And he says, well, this is 93. We had a pretty big ROTC program at my college. So a lot of guys had gotten shipped off the Desert Storm and had come back. And for the first time in my life, I heard the words post-traumatic stress disorder. And I said, what is that? He said, you had a traumatic experience. He said, I'm like, is this what you mean, like shell shock from Vietnam? He's like, yeah, that's exactly what this is, probably. And so I said, how do I make it end? Because every second of every day, I was just barely hanging on. It was just chaos in my head all the time. I couldn't control my thoughts at all. I couldn't control my emotions. It was just swinging all the time, but it was this constant terror every second of every day. And so he came up with this kind of theory that, well, this was probably triggered by the marijuana. And technically, it could last as long as the marijuana is in your system. And every dope smoker ever has to take a piss test knows 30 days, to clear yourself out. And so I'm thinking, okay, all I got to do is get through the next 30 days. And I just got to white knuckle it. And no one really ever offered me medication or anything like that at that time. So I was just like, all right, I just got to do this. And I'm asking the guy, what else should I do? He goes, well, cut out everything else, right? So I stopped cold, alcohol, weed, cigarettes, caffeine, everything. And I white knuckled it for a couple weeks and it started to get a little bit better and a little bit better. But one day I was sitting in my house and, all my friends are, weed smokers and everybody's sitting around smoking a joint or a pipe. And I pass the pipe from one person to the other and I catch a whiff of it and boom, it's like right back to level 11 again. And I go running out the back door of my house. And so now that kicked me off with starting to develop this paranoia and this phobia. And every time I smell marijuana, the switch flips again, takes me to the next level. So I just gutted it out for like 3 months. It was probably sometime, late summer when it finally kind of started to subside. I started to quote unquote feel normal again. But I learned coping mechanisms and I learned how to deal with this crippling anxiety. I didn't know that the word for it, yet was panic. I didn't know that until about 4 years later when, I'd stayed sober. I wasn't, I wouldn't touch alcohol. I wouldn't touch anything that I thought was going to change my state of mind because I thought it would induce another acid flashback. And so about 4 years later, I'm living in basically a generally normal life. And I'm standing at work one day, I'm running a bicycle shop in Chicago, and all of a sudden the switch gets flipped and I am in terror again. And I don't know what to do. And so I was talking to my sister. She and I actually were living together. We were roommates together. I said, look, after a couple of days, I'm like, I can't hide this from you. I need to tell you something happened to me. And I started explaining to her what I'm feeling like. And she's like, wait, I know what's going on with you. I said, no, you don't. Because I'd never told anybody in my family about what happened in college. Really, I hadn't told anybody except my girlfriend at the time and a couple of close friends. And so, she's like, okay, tell me your story. So I tell her a story. She goes, okay, that's great. She goes, but what you're having a panic attack. And I said, what's a panic attack? She said, it's exactly what you're talking about. I said, but this is like stuck, it's on. She's like, yeah, there's something else there. But it turned out that she had started having panic attacks her third year of law school, and she went to the emergency room, one night thinking she's having a heart attack. And when they were, the residents checking her in, they're like doing her test. They're like, wait, what do you do? She's like, I'm a third year law student. They're like, oh, we have like 6 of you guys in here every day having these panic attacks. It's all of you and the third year med students, right? And so I said, okay, what do I do? How do I deal with this? And so she, being the type A first child, she had sought out, when she started having this problem, she sought out the expert in the field and wound up going on the Oprah show to talk about panic disorder. And so she gets me paired up with this therapist who did individual, but then also did a group. And so now, next thing I know, I'm in this group with people with like severe phobias, like, can't drive on the expressway, can't get in an elevator, that kind of thing. And it didn't get better fast. And what happened over the course of like the next few months was I started developing all these like kind of severe phobias. And it was all around something that would make me start tripping again. Because I created this story in my head that I had gotten dosed or something, right? That must be why this happened. I had inadvertently gotten dosed, or intentionally gotten dosed. And so I developed all this like OCD and phobias about, and I basically didn't leave my house for a few months. So I'm living on the 20th floor of this high rise in downtown Chicago, and I'm, basically a shut-in because if I touch the railing going down the stairs to the L, I'm thinking I'm going to get dosed. And I put this narrative in my head that if I ate some takeout food, that it would take 30 to 45 minutes for the acid to kick in. So I would eat a couple bites, and I would sit there on the edge and wait and wait and wait. And then I'd be like, okay, it's not happening. So that was my life for a while.
Just so paranoid that something was going to trigger it again.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
So I just lived in constant fear of that. And then the other, this story started developing in my head, and about around all this. And then one day I was sitting there, and I had trouble breathing. I was like, and I'm just sitting on the couch, and I'm like, and I had been diagnosed with asthma when I was 13. I had to quit playing football because of it. And so I'm like, I'm having an asthma attack. And so I go and I like find my inhaler, which I never really carried, and I'm taking my inhaler. And this is not going away now either. And so I go to my asthma doctor, who was kind of my primary care physician since I was like 13. And I go there, and they're running all these tests, and they're putting me on all these steroids and all these, like asthma medication and stuff. And for the next year and a half, I was basically crippled. I couldn't walk up a flight of stairs without hitting on my inhaler. I couldn't ride a bicycle. I'm working in a bike store. I'm engaged to a girl who I met who was a customer at the bike store. This goes on for about a year and a half, and I'm on, usually when you go on steroids like prednisone, you're on them for like a week or two, maybe a month. I was on them for a year and a half, and they were really ravaging my body, but I just had this story in my head that like, this is asthma and I don't know what's going on and they can't figure it out. And I'm there, you know, this is a medical team at Northwestern University, one of the best hospitals in the country. And so finally one day, you know, my doctor's like, all right, look, we gotta take a look at some other things here. And it was never explained, and maybe they didn't know it back then, but you know, there's a lot of correlation, maybe causation between asthma, allergies, immune system stuff, and trauma. And so my doctor says, hey, I want you to go see the pulmonologist on the, the pulmonology department, the next floor down. So I go down there, they put me on the treadmill, they put me in one of those masks with all the tubes coming out of it, and the treadmill starts going and it starts lifting up and starts lifting up. And, keep in mind the last year and a half, I've been literally crippled. My life has been debilitated by this asthma. And, maxing out on my inhalers, maxing out on my steroids. And so this guy runs all these tests on me and he sits me down and he says, okay, so it could be one of three things. It could be this rare pulmonary thing. He's like, that's, little chance of that. Could be this. And he says, or it could be asthma. And he looks at me in the eyes and he says, but frankly, I don't think you have asthma. And just like that, the story that I created in my head got evaporated.
Really?
And I walked out of his office, I took the L home, I pulled my bike out of the garage, tires are flat, it's covered in dust. I filled the tires up and I went for a bike ride for the first time in a year and a half. And it was over. And it was that
You convinced yourself that you had asthma.
It was that moment when I realized if I could make myself sick through the power of my mind, then I can make myself heal through the same power.
Wow.
And so that kind of led me down on a journey of exploring, pushing my boundaries, changing the narrative, changing the lies, the stories that I was telling myself. Mm-hmm. And start to help me heal from this traumatic event that I had had in my life. And one of the things is going to sound ridiculous, but one of the things that I decided to do, I was like, I'm going to conquer every fear that I have in my life because I was just overwhelmed. I was living in my own self-created prison of fear of all these things I was afraid of. And one of them was I still had this phobia of alcohol, and certainly the smell of pot. But in my mind, like I couldn't even eat like an entree at a restaurant that was like cooked in white wine or something because it was going to make me start tripping out again. And so I decided I'm going to do immersion therapy for alcohol. Yeah, that was my brilliant idea. 8 years later. So I sat down with a buddy one night with a Sam Adams beer sitting in front of me, and I took a sip, and I white knuckled it, waiting to start tripping out again, and I didn't. And then a couple days later, I had a couple more sips, and then so I actually started drinking again, like socially, but. Because of what I'd gone through, my system kind of had this built-in braking system where I couldn't drink too much really. And I couldn't really my brain just wouldn't go to that much of a relaxed state because that was a danger zone, that I would kind of slip back into that. What I know now is, since I've been working with years, it's called cannabis or cannabis-induced psychosis or hallucinogen-induced psychosis. So it was 30 years later. Until I learned actually what the word for that was that happened to me. Yeah. But it kind of started me back on. I started drinking again, but not too much. It was like always kind of casual. I always had a handle on it. But that was kind of how then I lived for like the next 15 or 20 years or so. Just kind of doing that and doing some therapy here or there as things would get weird in my life. Diagnosed with anxiety, depression, panic disorder. I would not take any medication. Anything that I thought was going to change my state of mind, like a Xanax or even an antidepressant, was like, can't do it, can't do it.
So part of the paranoia? You mean,
yeah, huge part of the paranoia. So I learned coping mechanisms, and yoga literally saved my life back in those asthma days. I had a DVD, and I would just do the same yoga video every single day. And it was part of my routine, but it helped me it was breathing, right? Which was what I was doing. I was literally holding my breath. I kind of forgot how to breathe. And so I had to retrain myself how to breathe, and yoga was a huge part of that comeback process. Yeah.
So I want to open it up and let these guys ask some questions too, because I know just hearing that story, I'm like, my mind's going so many different directions. I didn't know any of that. I'm just curious where you're sitting today, and I know you well enough to know that like anxiety management, like you take you're very serious about your mental health, especially like you said earlier, working in this field. I know for me, when I came to Valiant, I would have argued with you that I had anxiety. I would have said, no way. I mean, I've dealt with some depression, but I'm just future focused, high urgency. I'm a leader. I've named all these things. And then I went through the tests and the assessments. They're like, dude, you're off the charts with anxiety. What are you talking about? And I actually didn't start having panic attacks till after I left Valiant, because I was just so good at powering through and not feeling the feelings, that then it was like when I got home and I was actually feeling stuff, then I was like, I went to the hospital. Like I was one of those guys that I thought I was having a heart attack. And the doctor was like, drink some water, big guy, go home, you're fine. You know, like that type of thing. I was like, no, I feel like, but it was the same type thing, anxiety attack. So for those of us that deal with anxiety ongoing, and that's something that we've learned here, is that you don't ever really kill it. You kind of learn how to manage it, and you learn how to live with it. What are some real practical just coping skills? What do you do now to keep yourself from going back into that state of mind?
So I mean, the biggest thing I do is exercise, and I'm not super consistent as much as I'd like to be, but and even just from a physiological standpoint with asthma, that's what they tell. Like the best medicine for asthma is exercise. But I mean, I haven't used an inhaler now for more than 15 or 20 years. But exercise helps me with my anxiety. It helps kind of burn off some of that stress. It helps me get in a mind state that's helpful. But it's also a breathing thing for me too, right? It's a cathartic breathing process. So that's number one. I do a daily. I do a daily meditation, and that involves a lot of breath work and stuff. And if I'm feeling really agitated, I'll do like box breathing, where you breathe in for 4, you hold 4, breathe out 4, hold 4, and kind of play around with that a little bit if I'm really activated.
Yeah.
But every day, and I notice like if it's a few days go by where I don't do my my meditation breath work. It's a practice like anything else. Is like getting in shape. The first time you go and do yoga, fuck, that's awkward, right? And then next thing you know,
First time, it's awkward for me the 100th time.
Day 30, you're like, well, I'm actually kind of craving this now, right? And it's the same thing for me with the meditation. Is that I feel the the thoughts start to spin out a little bit more when I haven't done it for a few days. So. Yeah, that's a big thing.
Another follow-up question from me, and then I'll want to hear what you guys have to say or whatever. But you talked about the story or the lies that you tell yourself. I mean, I've never heard that before. That powerful, like you were making yourself ill by your thinking through addiction and the struggles that we have in addiction. Can you unpack that a little bit more, and how do you see that show up specifically with addiction and addicts, and how we can tend to kind of live in those lies, really?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is these labels that we give ourselves, and I think for me, like both my brothers are in long-term recovery. They're younger than me. We're literally best friends. One's 11 years in recovery, one's 10 years. They're 8 years and 13 years younger than me, respectively, and it's it tends to run in the family, but I used to go to meetings with them when they were first getting sober to be supportive of them. But there was always this thing in my head, like I'd look around the room like, I'm not one of these people, right? And I've heard you talk about that, right? Showing up here. And I didn't want to identify, I didn't want that label, right? And even though my drinking never really got to that point, it actually got pretty close towards the end, where I was like legit, like having cravings, which I'd never had before. It was that kind of, that addiction. Hey, I'm an addict, right? And that's something that like, how is the world going to perceive me now? Because I'm a people pleaser, when I do all the assessments and stuff. It's like, yeah, you're this type, you're this personality profile. I'm a people pleaser. My number one schema is admiration and recognition thinking. When I first heard the phrase, "It's none of your business what someone else thinks of you," that was like earth shattering to me. I'm like, I spent my whole life just worried about what people think of me.
Yeah.
Right. And so, so then anxiety around addiction, I think comes, starts with that. At least it started that way for me. But it's, some of us are kind of pre-wired a little bit. Like I said earlier, I was always a little bit anxious as a kid. I was never like a freewheeling, hey, let's go egg this house and not have a care in the world. I was like, let's go egg this house, and then shit, I'm gonna be scared shitless that the cops are coming or I'm gonna get busted or that kind of thing, right? And so that was something that kind of lended itself to me. When it's funny because when I first reached out for help, I was just a couple months shy of 50 years old. I'm 53 now, and I wasn't drinking, but my emotions had completely come unglued, and I finally realized I can't manage my own life, and it was terrifying. So I called up my brother Drew, who and we live in the same neighborhood, and he had 7 or 8 years in recovery at that point, and we went for a walk, and I said I just broke down crying. I said I need help. He looked at me and he said, "I'd often wish that you had the gift of addiction." Wow. And I said, "The gift of addiction?" He said, "If you had become an addict the way that I did, then you would have had to deal with your shit a long time ago and all the stuff that you haven't looked into." Wow. And that blew my mind, right? As it turns out, so I went into treatment. I went somewhere else first for 30 days, and I went in for primary mental health, right? And but it wasn't until I got to Valiant, several months after that, where I was sitting in the addiction interaction group, which was run by our former clinical director, Steven Spinono, amazing clinician. And I walked in that group, and again, I'm here for primary mental health, but I'm like, yeah, I'll go to the AA meetings and stuff like that. I'll get something out of it, right? But I walk into that first group, and I thought to myself, well, I don't know what I'm going to get out of this group, right? I'm not an addict. And at some point during that group, I opened up my notebook and I wrote across the top of a clean page, "I am addicted to." And by the end of that group, the page was full. And it was love and sex and women and food and sugar and drama and alcohol. Because I had never, quote unquote, gone off the rails with any of those things, in maybe, what I viewed as like an addict sense, I never associated with myself as an addict until then. But I am, and that's the honest truth. And knowing that about myself has been the most liberating thing, that I've gone through, honestly. Yeah, because I've just gotten to know myself, a whole lot better, and all the experiences that I'd gone through, helped shape who I am. Carl Jung said, we're not what happened to us. We are what we choose to become. And again, going back to these stories in our head, right? Like, 1954, Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile. Up until that point, no one knew that it could be done. How long did that record last? 46 days. And then somebody broke it again. And then somebody broke it again and again within a few weeks. It was a story, people had told themselves, can't be done, right? And then one person did it, and it was like, hey, maybe I can do this. Yeah. And so that's what I kind of, latch onto now is like, my default is always like, I can't do that. I'm not strong enough. I'm not, fast enough, young enough, whatever the case may be, rich enough, I don't have enough time. But I keep just trying to push those boundaries in all different kind of parts of my life and stop that narrative that's in my head that's been limiting me my whole life. So I finally feel like, at 50 years old, I was like as free as I'd ever been in terms of possibilities. So I went from feeling like, how am I going to get through this day and survive the remaining years of my life to, I only get this much time left now, and I want to do everything I can with it. Yeah. Man,
I'm just really, I can relate to what you're saying. I mean, it's hitting home for me, everything you're saying. I've got so many follow-up questions. I'll call you later. We'll talk about it. But I don't want to be selfish. You guys, what's coming up for you?
Yeah.
I'm curious in terms of, so like with your story, start with that acid trip, and a bunch of things happened in the preceding years. And you kind of mentioned in college that you had like a girlfriend, and then you had like a fiance that you met at the bike shop, and then like, fast forward to the age of 50, you're with your dog doing like a real estate deal intermittently, before you go to Valiant. So like, I was just curious to hear specifically like how maybe mental health or addiction or whatever it was in your life that you were trying to work through, which is why you ended up going to Valiant. Like, how did those things like hinder relationships, and maybe not just romantically, but romantic and just like relationships in general?
Yeah, it's a great question, Harry, because that was the other piece to the puzzle that I didn't really figure out until I got into treatment. So I had my traumatic experience from the acid trip, and then it turns out that these things that had happened to me when I was a kid, like my earliest sexual experiences with other kids, but older kids, it turns out that those were really impactful, and I didn't know this, for a long time. But Coach Dan actually, was the one who pointed out to me like all addiction is an intimacy disorder. And when I started to finally piece it together, like, there were 4 amazing women in my life, like from, after college, who, I got close to marrying, but I would go through this cycle of shame and guilt. And because I always felt like my journey is a life sentence. Like, being me is not fun. It's a roller coaster ride, and I wouldn't wish this ride on anyone, especially an amazing woman who loves me and deserves the best in life. And so I would sabotage every relationship that I was in. And so I started to be able to identify this cycle that I would go through. And that's how I found myself, 50 years old, never married, no kids. When I was in high school, I didn't, you get asked, hey, what do you want to do with your life?
Yeah.
And I always answer the same way. I don't know what I want to do for a career, but I know I want to be a dad. And I was actually being kind of like, courted by the priesthood, because I was educated by the Jesuits of 16 years of Catholic education. And I was seriously considering, going down the line of the priesthood. But I really loved women, and I wanted to be a dad. And so I didn't. So there's this really kind of cruel irony that all these years later, it never happened for me. But actually, even in a fit of shame, before I went into treatment a couple months before, I went and got a vasectomy, because I was just like, I want to just close the door on this. I was angry. My life hadn't worked out the way that it should have. And I used to say, I didn't get married because it never happened for me. But really the truth is I never made it happen. I pushed a lot of women away. I hurt a lot of women along the way. And some of my friends to this day still think, that I'm picky, or, and it's not that. It's that I hated myself so much. I had so much self-loathing that I didn't want to put, a woman that would love me through that pain of going through life with me. Uh-huh. Yeah. So it was, once I got here, and another program I was at for a month, did some great work up there, and they were like, after 30 days, I'm like, I got to get out of here. I got to get back to my life. And my therapist there told me, look, Peter, with your compound trauma, with the childhood stuff, and then the college stuff, you need 60 to 90 days. And I was like, I don't have the time. I don't have the money. I got this, right? And then even at Valiant, it was like a good 40 days before, I had shared like some of this stuff that happened to me as a kid in the closed room with a therapist. But I wasn't sharing it with my brothers in the program, until one day I just woke up and it just had to come out, right? It'd been something I'd been carrying for so long, and I was exhausted. And we used to do a check-in every morning at the PHP house. It was called Amherst House. And me and Sean in this house, Eric, who was just on the Zoom call, And so we do a check-in for like a half an hour every morning before we'd come over to the center. And so one morning I just woke up and I was just like, I got to get this out. And so I shared it during that check-in, and it just all came out, like bawling, crying. And that was one of the most liberating things I'd ever done. I thought it was my cross to bear, because I had been initiated into this kind of, sexual activity by older kids, and then I became one of the initiators as I got older. And so I had this cross to bear, classic, Catholic guilt, right? I didn't understand the difference between guilt and shame until I got here. The difference being guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad.
Yeah.
Right? And that's how I always felt. I always felt there's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with me. What is wrong with me? It's a question I asked myself a million times over the course of my life. And then finally I learned that that wasn't the right question I was asking. I should have been asking myself, what happened to me?
Wow.
And so that's how I got, to where I am. And so I've just now kind of started to dip my toe back into, showing up in a relationship and, and being healthy about it, and working on codependency and love addiction and, abandonment issues and, all that stuff that, we know these things happen to us as kids, right? And some of them were, some of us had things happen that were absolutely awful and tragic. Others of us had things happen that were like, I didn't really realize like how important it was, how it impacted my development as a kid and as a person, and being able to connect to other people. Yeah. So, yeah.
It's really,
Thanks, that answered the question
Yeah.
very well.
Thanks.
it's really good stuff, man.
So I
Yeah,
kinda
Herm?
had a question, like, have you ever done any IFS work, for yourself? Because that's what I'm doing right now, and I'm slowly getting to the point where, like, I'm feeling more and more free, more and more myself, and less burdened by, like, all these parts that are just really tearing me apart, kinda like, I was a colic baby, and I carried that anxiety till now, I still carry that, and then depression shows up and tries to kick that in the butt, and it's just like a roller coaster ride for me too, so I can totally relate. So, have you done any IFS work, and has that impacted you in any way?
Yeah, it's been a huge part of me helping to understand who I am and those parts of me. I kind of found it on my own at Valiant. There was a book on the shelf. It wasn't written by Dick Schwartz, who invented IFS, but it was written by one of kind of his proteges. And I kind of found that book and started reading it. We weren't really doing like so much IFS work here at that time, but I learned about, hey, there are these different parts that were created to help me get through these hard points in my life when either my needs weren't being met as a kid, or when I'm having traumatic experiences, and the managers and the firefighters and the exiles. And it helped me change that narrative of what's wrong with me and why am I like this, to, hey, this is just a part of me that's taking over. And what it's really helped me, and I listen to a lot of podcasts on IFS, and I've read Dick Schwartz's books and stuff, and done some of that work in my own therapy with my own therapist, and it's really helped me, again, change that narrative from, this isn't who I am. This is just a part of me, and I've been able to take those parts that were driving the car for a long time, right, and put them in the back seat. And yeah, they still, backseat drive on me and chirp at me, at times when I'm like getting stressed out and stuff. For the most point, I'm more operating from my true self now. And I just picture that, that hub and spoke system, right, of IFS, like true self, and then all these different parts, right? And it's really helpful to me to not let my story start to develop, my narrative start to take over, like I'm always going to be this way, right? All those extremes. I'm never going to get better. I'm always going to be this way. I can't be in a relationship because I'm going to go jump back to this. I can't have a stressful job because it's going to lead me to this, right? And so it's like, no, that's just that part of you that's trying to protect you from getting hurt, and give it, let its voice be heard, but then also kind of put it in its place. So yeah.
Let's do one more. Thanks, Karen. Great question.
Have those panic attacks subsided?
You know what? Yeah, for the most part, and I used to get them. You know, I'd still get them like when I get stressed, and I get them in the middle of the night, and they call them, you know, nocturnal or night terrors, right? And you know, when I was really going, you know, going in deep into therapy, they actually started getting worse. And when I started at Valiant, they started getting worse because I was now opening that door, right? And I was tapping into that stuff that I avoided for so long. And so, so for the most part, they've gone away. Again, because of therapeutic work that I did around them. But occasionally, you know, like I'll have one. And, you know, I had one, I remember we went and did a hike up at St. Mary's Glacier when I was a client, and we didn't have the blue bus, we had a Suburban. And I remember coming back from a hike, and all of a sudden, just like, boom, panic attack. But it really helped me because I was able to like process it with the guys in the car right away and be like, hey, this is happening. But once I dug into all that stuff and forgave myself and, you know, did some, did empty chair work and psychodrama and stuff and talked to my younger self and wrote letters to my younger self and forgave myself, that it basically all went away. Yeah. And now I can even like, you know, even like the paranoia around like the marijuana and stuff, like I can go to, you know, I can go to a concert and where there's weed all over the place and be okay with it now. It still elevates me a little bit, but I can keep myself, you know, regulated. Yeah. So yeah. So it's been amazing. Like there's all these tools, right? It's been a long journey for me, you know, 28 years basically of doing therapy off and on and finding coping mechanisms. But that's the amazing thing. There's so many tools, and we come into this world and we didn't even know this world existed, right? Until we walk into treatment, and so it's great because I've got this whole, you know, I've got every club in my bag now.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like that I need. Yeah.
Pete, it's really good stuff, man.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Thanks, buddy.
sharing your
Yeah.
story and all this. Like we say thanks to Pete
man.
for
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you.